All right, so we're back. Back to our stories, back to looking at the Bible and seeing if we can find answers to that question, who is this Jesus? Who is this Jesus? Now, you recall that last week we learned a little bit more about Jesus, and in our story, you remember that Jesus had taken his disciples, he had taken them into a room, and they were together eating a special feast that was called the Passover. And you remember at that time he had taken up a piece of bread and he had broken it in front of them, and he had poured out some wine in front of them. And when he did that, he said, just like this bread breaks, my body also has to break. And just like this wine is poured out, my blood will be poured out too. And you remember that we said Jesus was trying to help his disciples understand the things that were going to happen. Jesus knew what was going to happen next. He knew he was very close to the time when he would be taken away and he would be put up on a cross and that he would die. And he knew these things were coming, but his disciples didn't, and he wanted them to understand. He also wanted you and me to understand these things too. And so you remember that we said that churches today still do that. They still break bread and they pour out wine so that they can remember and believe what Jesus did for us. So now you probably also remember that, well, they were gathered here together. Jesus had said to them, one of you is going to betray me. And most of the disciples didn't know what he was talking about, and they all thought, well, was it me? Was it me? And of course, only one of them, that was Judas, he was the only one who knew for sure, yeah, that was me. And in fact, he even left that meal, and he went on that very night to betray Jesus. And so when this meal was over, the disciples went with Jesus together to their special place. They went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and it was evening there, and they gathered there together. And you remember from last week, we said that Jesus had gone a little bit away from them. He went a little bit away from the disciples to be alone, to pray. Jesus was deeply sad at that time. He was troubled. He knew what was coming, and so he prayed to his Father in heaven. He said, I have to do your will. Help me with this. And you remember at the same time that he was praying, the disciples fell asleep. And Jesus went back to them and said, why are you sleeping? And that happened 3 times. And so we saw that the disciples were not getting the things that were happening, but Jesus was ready to go to the cross. And this was hard for Jesus. It was hard because he had to go and he had to do it alone. And so while they were in this garden, and it was night and it was quiet, all of a sudden, Judas had come there with this mob, and the mob had swords and clubs and torches, and they were coming to get Jesus. And you remember that even though it was a little bit chaotic, Jesus just looked at his friend Judas and said, do what you have to do. Do what you came here to do. And now you might remember that Judas had planned with this mob that there would be a special signal to let the mob know that this was the man that they had to arrest. And so he arranged it beforehand that when they came there, he would do this signal, and then the mob would know that Jesus was the guy they had to arrest. Now, that brings us to our review question of the week. Do you remember what that signal was? What was the signal that Judas used to betray Jesus? What was that signal? If you can remember what that was, what Judas did to Jesus when he came into the garden, then send a message to myself or to Danielle, and we'll keep track of who got it right, and we'll make sure that you guys get a prize later on. If you're having a hard time remembering what happened and what Judas did, then I suggest that you open up a Bible and you find the answer, because the answer's in there. And you can find that in Matthew 26, verse 48. So if you open up your Bible to Matthew 26, verse 48, you will find the answer to that review question. And of course, if you don't have a Bible at home, then you can ask Danielle and I, and we will get you your very own Bible so that you can follow along with these stories. So after Judas did this, then his mob knew that was Jesus, and that was the guy they had to arrest, and so they had their swords and their clubs, and there could have been a big fight. And you remember that Peter even stepped in to defend his Lord Jesus, and he had swung his sword at one of the men and chopped off their ear, and yet a big brawl didn't happen. It didn't turn into a big fight because Jesus calmed things down. Jesus knew he had to be arrested, and so he even healed that man's ear, and then he gave himself up to the mob. He said, "Take me." And the disciples, they fled. They ran away. They deserted their friend Jesus, and they took off in this direction, that direction, and they left. And Jesus was left alone with the soldiers, with the mob, and he was bound, and he was arrested, and they were going to take him away. Jesus alone had to go to the cross. Jesus alone had to go and do what he had to do, and his disciples abandoned him. And so that brings us to today's story. And today's story is going to be about the trial of Jesus and Peter's denial. The trial of Jesus and Peter's denial. Now, maybe that word trial is something that you haven't heard before. Maybe you don't know what that means. So let me just explain what that is a little bit. A trial is something that happens when, if you, for example, do something wrong, if you break a law, then you have to go in front of a judge, and that judge will have to determine, they will have to see, did you really do something wrong, yes or no? And so if they realize, yes, you did something wrong, you broke the law, well, then you get a punishment. And the judge will determine, they will think, okay, this is the punishment that I'm going to give you, and because you did something wrong. And if you're innocent, if you didn't do it, then the judge can say, nope, he didn't do it, you can go free. So that's what a trial is. That's what's going to happen in our story to Jesus today. So the people who arrested Jesus first brought him to the home of the high priest. It's here that a small crowd started to gather, and they wanted to accuse Jesus of all the things that he did wrong. And so people started coming forward and saying, he did this wrong. And someone else would say, no, it was this. This is the thing that he did wrong, that we can really nail him on that. And that's how we can find him guilty. And so some people were saying one thing, and other people were saying another thing. And as they kept talking, their stories were not always lining up. And so they couldn't even really figure out what it was that they were going to say that Jesus did wrong. They couldn't find proper evidence. They couldn't think of all the things that Jesus said and did and taught, and they just couldn't come up with evidence to prove that Jesus was guilty. And so in this commotion, the high priest finally looked at Jesus and he said to him, "Are you the Messiah? Do you think that you're the Messiah?" And of course, this is an important thing for the Jews, for the Israelites. They were all waiting for this Messiah. They were waiting for God's special chosen king. They knew somebody was coming. God had promised them. And they sort of knew that Jesus had claimed to be this Messiah. And so Jesus, looking at them and looking at the high priest, he said, "I am." And then he also said, "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God." Now, you might not think that that's a big statement or that's a really bad thing to say, but what Jesus had essentially said to them, what he had basically said was that he was like God. He was saying that he would be brought up into a special place to be with God and sit down at God's right hand. And you could imagine that the people in the room were absolutely furious. They were so angry. How dare Jesus say this about himself? That he's equal to God, that he can sit down at the right hand of God? That's a place of authority. And he's claiming to be just like God. In fact, they had a word for this. It was called blaspheming. Maybe you've heard of that, blaspheming. And so they accused Jesus in the moment. They said, that is blasphemy. How dare he say that? How dare he think that he's as great as God? No one can say that. You're a man. They were looking at him and they could see that he was a man. And this man in front of them claiming to be like God. And so they said, that's blasphemy. We don't have to hear anything else. We don't need any other evidence. He's clearly said it right in front of our own eyes. And he's guilty. And the punishment for blasphemy was death. Now, while this was all happening, Peter was just outside. Peter had first run away when Jesus was arrested, but then he sort of followed the crowd at a distance. He wanted to see what Jesus was doing. And so he followed along, and he was watching the mob take Jesus, and he was maybe listening in on the conversation, but he stayed outside. He stayed a little bit away from the mob who was in front of the high priest, accusing Jesus of all these things. And as he did that, he was outside beside a little fire. It was probably cool. It was now late into the night, almost morning. And so he was beside this fire, and he was warming himself up and getting warm, and there's commotion all around Jesus. He's probably afraid at this time and wondering what's going on here. But as he did this, a young servant girl came up to the fire too and was warming herself up. And as she did that, she looked at Peter, and she looked at him, and she thought, aren't you one of those friends of Jesus? Don't you know Jesus, the guy that they have in there, that they have arrested, and they're accusing him of things? And Peter was warming himself by the fire, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know that guy. I don't know him. And so the young girl probably walked away and thought, I thought he was a friend of Jesus. I thought I've seen him with him. But Peter denied it. So Peter stood there a little while longer, warming himself up around that fire, staying warm as the commotion continued inside with the high priest and Jesus. And as he was standing there, another man came up and stood beside him at the fire. And he also looked at Peter, and he thought, You're one of the friends of Jesus. You're with that guy, the guy that they have there arrested. You're one of his friends. And again, Peter shook his head. Oh, no, not me, no. I don't know him. I don't know that man. And so that guy, too, walked away and thought, oh, okay, I thought he was a friend of Jesus. And then finally, once again, another person came up to the fire beside Peter. This person was actually one of the people who were there in Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested. And so as he comes around the fire, he knows a lot of the things that just happened. And he's looking at Peter, and he's going, I know you. I just saw you. You're one of the followers of Jesus. You're one of his friends. You're with him. And Peter says in that moment, No, I don't know that man. I don't know him. He's not my friend. I'm not with him. And in that moment, suddenly off in the distance, Peter heard a rooster. The rooster crowed. And you remember from last week, we had talked about this, that during the Last Supper, Jesus had said to Peter, before the rooster crows 3 times, you're going to deny me. Before the rooster crows in the morning, you know how roosters like to crow in the morning. Before the rooster does that, Peter, you will deny me 3 times. And so after Peter heard this rooster crowing, he was so sad. He remembered Jesus' words, and he was sad, and he wept. Jesus was right. He had denied him. Not only did he denied him once, but he denied him 3 times. 3 times he pretended he didn't know Jesus. So now the crowd who had arrested Jesus and had determined together, they decided together that Jesus had committed blasphemy and he was needing to die. He had to be executed. He had to be killed. That crowd of people took Jesus away to the next judge, to the judge who would determine if Jesus was guilty or innocent. They took him to a man named Pontius Pilate. They took him to Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate was a Roman. You remember that the Romans were the nation that had taken over Israel, and they were now in charge, and they were ruling. And Pontius Pilate was one of the rulers who ruled over the area of Jerusalem, or in the area around Jerusalem. And so they took him to Pilate so that Pilate could be the judge. Pilate had to determine, is Jesus innocent or is he guilty? Now, as they brought Jesus to Pilate, Pilate didn't really want to deal with Jesus. He was looking at Jesus and looking at the priests and the rulers of the Jews, and he thought, this is your problem. This is a Jewish problem. This is you Israelites. I don't want anything to do with this. Just why don't you just try him yourself and punish him according to your laws? But the chief priests, they pushed Pilate even more. They pushed Pilate and said, no, you have to try him. You see, the Jews couldn't put him to death. The Jews couldn't put Jesus to death. They needed the Roman ruler, Pilate, to condemn Jesus. If that happened, then for sure Jesus would be put to death. And so they pushed Jesus towards Pilate, and Pilate had to deal with Jesus. And so Pilate, he thought, I got to think about these things. Bring Jesus to me. And so Jesus was brought to Pilate. And Pilate began to question him. He was trying to figure out, who is this Jesus? And what has he done? Why is this mob so angry at him? And what am I going to do about this? And so he began to ask him questions and try to figure out what the people were so angry about and why they wanted Jesus dead. And then he asked Jesus something very important. He asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? You see, Pilate had probably heard a little bit about Jesus, and he probably heard that Jesus had sort of claimed to be some special sort of king. And so he looked at Jesus and he said, are you the king of the Jews? And so Jesus sort of answered him and said, well, where did you hear that? Who'd you hear that from? And where'd you get that idea? And at this point, Pontius Pilate was probably getting frustrated with the situation and frustrated with Jesus. And he just said, I'm not a Jew. I'm not an Israelite. You're not my people. I don't know who you are, and I'm just trying to figure it out. And so Jesus said to him, I am a king, just as you have said. I am a king. But my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. I have come to bring truth into this world. I was born to be a king for my people. Pontius Pilate was probably even more frustrated with this. What is Jesus talking about? Who is this man claiming to be a king, claiming to be born for some special job to bring truth into this world? And all the while he's talking to Jesus, outside he could probably hear this mob starting to gather, this angry mob who really wanted Jesus dead. And Pontius Pilate, he was stuck. He was the judge. It was his job to determine guilty or innocent. Guilty or innocent. And as Pilate thought about these things, and he thought about everything that he had heard and what he had just heard from Jesus, he couldn't think of a reason to condemn Jesus. He couldn't think of a reason to say, yeah, Jesus is guilty of breaking the law. He couldn't think of one. And of course, you and I know that he couldn't think of one because there was no reason to condemn Jesus. Jesus was standing before Pilate, bound as a prisoner, but he was innocent. He had broken no law. He had not only not ever broken a law, he had done things perfectly. He lived a perfect life. He loved people. He cared for people. He healed people. You know the stories. And so there was no reason at all for Pilate to have this man killed. There was no reason for him to find him guilty. And this probably frustrated Pontius Pilate because he knew in his mind this man was innocent, but he could also hear this crowd forming outside. And so Pilate thought of a plan. He thought he was pretty smart. You know what? I have a way that I can solve this. I can figure it out so that the mob can be happy, and I don't have to have this innocent man killed. So there was a rule that they followed, that the Romans followed, that once a year during the time of the Passover, the Jewish people were allowed to have one prisoner set free. They were allowed to go to the Romans and choose one prisoner who was set free. And so Pontius Pilate, he knew this, and so he brought forward to the crowd, he went outside with Jesus, and he also brought another man, and this man's name was Barabbas. Well, Barabbas was a big man. He was very different than Jesus. He was a man who had led a rebellion. He had actually killed someone. He was a murderer. And he was standing there beside Jesus, who was innocent, hadn't done anything wrong. So Pontius Pilate thought, this should be easy. I'll put these two prisoners in front of the crowd and let them set one free. Obviously, they're going to choose Jesus to be set free. He's obviously not a threat. They're not going to choose Barabbas, this murderer, this person who could cause another riot and cause more chaos. And so Pontius Pilate gave the crowd the option. Who should I set free? Who should I release? Which prisoner? Barabbas or Jesus? And that crowd was angry and they were yelling, but it didn't take them long to say, release Barabbas! Release Barabbas! Let him go! We'll take Barabbas! Punish Jesus! Punish Jesus! Let Barabbas free. It must have shocked Pontius Pilate to hear this, that this angry crowd actually wanted the murderer Barabbas set free and this obviously innocent man Jesus to get punished. But what could he do? The crowd was yelling. The crowd was angry. And so he did exactly what they wanted. He gave them Barabbas. He said, here you go, have Barabbas. And he kept Jesus arrested. He kept Jesus arrested, kept him in prison. And then he turned to the crowd and he said to them, well, what should I do with this Jesus? What should I do with him? And the crowd yelled, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" And the noise got louder and louder and louder. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" They wanted Jesus dead. They wanted him killed. They were done with this Jesus. They had heard enough of him. And so Pontius Pilate gave in to the crowd. He set Barabbas free, an obvious murderer, and the innocent man Jesus he condemned as guilty. He gave a judgment. He said, Jesus is guilty. He will be crucified. Crucified means put on a cross to die. Well, that's our story today. And another sad story, I guess. Another low point in the Bible again, where we have this Jesus who has to stand in front of a judge. He's brought there. And the judge has to determine, he has to decide innocent or guilty. And one of the worst things ever in the world to happen happened. An innocent man gets told he's guilty. The innocent Jesus gets told, you're going to die. You're going to be crucified. And so as we learn more answers to this question, who is this Jesus? We see that he's an innocent man condemned to die. And again, yeah, this sounds like really bad news. This sounds horrible. Nobody wants an innocent person to die. This sounds like really bad news. And yet, I want to tell you that there's some good news there. There is some good news coming. Next week, when we tell the next stories, we'll talk about the cross. We'll talk about Jesus having to get put up on the cross to die. And I want to assure you, I want to tell you that he had to do it. And because he did that, we can have life. Jesus was going to die so that we could have life. Next week is Good Friday, and then the Sunday after is Easter. And we're going to continue to talk about these things. Continue to try to understand how important the cross is for us. And maybe it's a little bit hard to see now, but the important thing that we learned today is that Jesus was innocent. He did nothing wrong. And we also saw that Jesus was abandoned. Not only did Judas betray him, Peter also denied him. His disciples had scattered, and Peter, his closest friend, had completely denied even knowing Jesus. Jesus had to go to the cross alone. The innocent man had to go to the cross to die, and he would do it alone. Next week, we'll hear the story of the cross. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us and ask us. We'll give our best answers. And I hope you tune in again next week on Wednesday. We'll have another story for you. And I hope it helps you, and I hope you can have more understanding have more answers to this question about who is this Jesus.